Hey all you cats and kittens and all you non-binary fittens, it's your boy, DBiddles. Welcome to Chatbots. Alright, that's the greeting out of the way, now here's the pitch. I build anime robot models, I chat about the anime that model is from, and then I try to tie that chat to some bigger discussion. Now sometimes that discussion trends a little lighthearted and frivolous, but often that discussion leans a little heavy and political and, alright, let's not mince words today, viewer. That's the direction this one is headed. Recent events in the real world are kind of driving the material behind today's video even more so than usual. I hadn't planned on approaching this particular subject in this particular way at this time, and even had a few other scripts and kits I had ready to go, but this is just one of those things I just don't feel like I can totally overlook or ignore. Not in the name of algo chasing, mind you, but because it's kind of a really big fucking deal. Now this is normally the part where I tell you a bit about the bot, and I did write up a whole giant lore dump for the Gundam Universal Century, and I was gonna tie all the themes to our actual topic, which would have been pretty easy. You know, senseless brutality, people who are in the wrong on both sides driving this conflict that hurts lots of innocent people caught in the middle, lots of children being drafted to fight on behalf of their father's sins, one side clearly far more brutal than the other, the failings of liberalism giving way to fascism masquerading as populism, the ambitions of the Zabi family which co-opt and exploit the anxieties of a traditionally marginalized demographic to justify authoritarianism, colony drops, the military-industrial complex, souls weighed down by Earth's gravity, Amuro and Lala cutting through the noise to understand each other with new type bullshit, blah blah blah, the whole nine. But not only was it way longer than even my Scope Dog intro, but it kind of feels wrong to look at what's happening and go, "Oh, this is just like in my Japanese anime!" Art is a great way to intellectually grapple with and contextualize real-world issues, but I think things are a little too real and too raw right now. So we'll save all that for another day and another time. No bot chat for this one, we're just gonna go for it, buckle up. Like I said, I didn't plan to make this video in this way under these circumstances, but I kind of felt like I couldn't go without remarking on current events given what they are. My channel tends to wade pretty heavily into the waters of political themes and messaging, and tying that to the media that I like. Hopefully in doing so, I'm effectively communicating how all-encompassing and inescapable the realm of politics is, even in seemingly unconnected mediums. And hopefully I'm helping others who might not normally think too hard about this stuff to then take a longer look at the world around us. So much of what I discuss are broad, sadly evergreen subjects that I can feel free to talk about at my leisure, and I don't feel obligated to address every news story that makes headlines. The 24-hour news cycle constantly turns, and there's very little time to focus on any one thing since there'll be something new to talk about every time your thumb scrolls your feed. But as much political material as there is to work with these days in all manner of subjects and important topics, and as much as I tend to feed into the trope of Americans only knowing anything about the goings-on of America, I feel like it's really hard to say that there's any bigger story at this exact moment in time than the Israel-Palestine conflict. And given the severity of that situation, I felt that it'd be irresponsible of me to overlook addressing it as someone who tends to cover such political topics. I don't plan to make a habit out of this, I hope I don't have to, but I don't feel like this particular story is one we can afford to just ignore. So here's a quick summary for those of us who are too engrossed in playing Baldur's Gate 3 to look up from their own personal lives. On October 7th, 2023, the southern region of Israel was suddenly attacked from the Palestinian Gaza Strip by several hundred armed insurgents from the Islamist extremist group Hamas. Hamas broke through the heavily guarded perimeter wall with paragliders, killing around 1,200 people, though early reports estimated 1,400, and most of those were civilians. Hamas also kidnapped around 240 more civilians before retreating. This was one of the deadliest attacks that Israel has faced in its entire history, surpassing the death tolls of both the First and Second Intifadas, which were multi-year conflicts between Israel and Palestine, which lasted late 1987 to late 1993, and late 2000 to early 2005, respectively. This year has also been particularly devastating for Palestinians. Palestine's West Bank has experienced record levels of Israeli-provoked violence this year, and that's before Israel declared a retaliatory war for October 7th, a war that has since claimed the lives of almost 22,000 Palestinians and counting. Not 22,000 in Hamas militants' mind, just 22,000 Palestinians in general in both the Gaza Strip, where Hamas is located, and the West Bank, where Hamas is not located. Right. Cool. Now, I should note for those of you who do not have maps in front of you that Palestine's Gaza Strip, where Hamas is, and Palestine's West Bank, where Hamas isn't, are two territories that are not connected. They're actually separated by Israeli territory, and Israel has a great big border wall on all sides. So, you can't really just hop from the Gaza Strip to the West Bank. And remember, Hamas is the group that started this conflict, supposedly. And so that would be who Israel would want to, focus their attention on, right? Okay, just making sure we're all on the same page. Now, as long as I've ever been vaguely politically aware, which would probably be about 5th grade when my teachers turned on the news to watch the World Trade Center attack, the Middle East has always kind of been a huge topic of discussion, and even before all that too, in fact. And for every American who wants to remain blissfully ignorant on current events, we tend to employ the mostly accurate thought-terminating cliche of, it's complicated. And it is. There's a number of nations in this region with intricate and nuanced histories and sometimes very bad blood between them. And truth be told, I'm not an expert on any of that. I'm gonna admit I did a little boning up on all this before I wrote this script. I didn't read any books. What are you, crazy? I've got a wife, a kid, and a full-time job eating up a lot of my time. And my focus isn't always the best for super dry academic tomes. No, it was some YouTube and Wikipedia for me, gang. Now, I know that's not regarded as the most reliable of sources, but not every YouTube video is crazy uncle conspiracies and revisionist history. At least some of them have to have some good information. And while anyone can edit Wikipedia articles, anyone can just edit them back, and there's some real dedicated folks who go through and double check a lot of that stuff. Now, I'll leave links to the YouTube videos I watched in the description. I encourage you all to check them out, and obviously anyone can poke around Wikipedia. But I suspect that for a lot of people, even that won't be sufficient. For some people, they'll claim that my limited knowledge disqualifies me from weighing in on this subject. But let's face it, limited knowledge to one degree or another has never stopped anyone at all from ever talking about anything in all of human history. And anyone saying that would likely just be trying to leverage their supposed superior knowledge on the subject into browbeating me into conforming to their opinions. And for some people, so long as my reports or perspective don't align with theirs, my knowledge will be insufficient. I could read and watch dozens of books and articles and documentaries, but if I'm not siding with your side, you'll just assume my ignorance. Isn't that funny? People always assume you're well-educated when you say stuff they agree with, even if you know next to nothing and are just parroting the talking heads on TV. And for others, they'll claim that my sources are biased, and yeah, I'll admit it, it's possible that they are. But it's also very possible that they aren't, and that for some people, the truth just kinda hurts. But the tensions are just so high that they can't really admit it. Now, I've obviously heard a lot of editorializing on this topic from the various sources I normally turn to for current events, but that's standard of just about any outlet you get the news from. What you cover and how you cover it is always curated in a way to lead someone to draw certain conclusions, even if you're only stating facts. Manufactured consent is a pretty standard play in most mainstream news outlets, and every other non-mainstream outlet is separate from the mainstream because the biases they represent don't align with the mainstream. And let's face it, any source that the critics would rather I look at will also be biased. Everyone has a bias. Even if you're just stating facts, whichever facts you choose to include or exclude will also reflect a bias. There's not really any such thing as unbiased news. I probably won't be able to convince everyone of all the facts as I understand them, but I think what's important is an acknowledgement of the human element here, because that's kind of the most significant factor in all of this. I'm always about people first, and I hope that my content reflects that. So please just hear me out, and then when all is said and done, you can give me your good faith criticism on the substance of my assertions in the comments. And if you want to debate the facts as I present them or the conclusions that I draw, please feel free to do so in the comments, and maybe, if I have nothing else better to do, I'll respond to you. Anyways, sources down below for some of the Reader's Digest history lessons I received. I recommend taking a look at them, but in case you don't, I'll give you an even more abbreviated rundown of the last century and change of history of the region. Okay, so the region known as Palestine has been home to many civilizations and peoples over the millennia, and has been called many things. Many factions can at one point in time have been said to have lived there. And it's also noteworthy to point out that Judaism and Christianity both originated in this region, and that the city of Jerusalem, right smack dab in the middle, is the designated holy city for the three major Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. It also cannot be overstated that anti-Semitism, the hatred of the Jewish people, is easily the single most virulent and prolific form of bigotry the world over, and has been for a very, 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 very long time. The Nazis, after all, didn't start the hatred of the Jews. They were just some of the most direct and effective at doing anti-Semitism here in recent history. And that's remarkable, given just how few Jewish folks there are in the world compared to many other demographics. It's roughly 15.7 million Jewish folks globally as of 2023, roughly 40% of whom live in modern-day Israel. This figure is in no small part due to the brutal genocide of 6 million Jewish people in the Holocaust. But just because that is the case, it does not excuse bigotry on behalf of Jewish folks towards other demographics, nor does it make such bigotries insignificant. See my previous video on King for some further instances of bigotry being demonstrated by minority populations for incredibly poorly thought out short-term reasons. Now, I am skipping over, let's face it, a vast majority of world history here, but as important as all that is, we humans live fast, fleeting existences, and the full weight of countless prior millennia doesn't always weigh on us and our actions. Sometimes we're actually mostly just the products of the past century or two, reenacting cyclical events from so much history we refuse to remember. Now, the majority of the Jewish population had been driven from the region of Palestine for many years due to a number of conflicts, and from 1516 to 1922, which was the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire had colonized the region. Palestine's population was at this time roughly 90% Arabic, which is to say Islamic, and the remaining percentage was some hodgepodge of Christians, Jews, and others. You may have noticed I'm conflating race and religion a little here. Obviously, these two elements are not synonymous, but in terms of history and politics, they tend to get combined. But, as it were, under the Ottomans, these various demographics were able to cohabitate relatively well. Anyways, the end of World War I saw the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, and then British Foreign Minister Arthur Balfour envisioned the region as an independent Jewish nation-state, which was in contrast to an earlier agreement Britain had made with the Arab population, namely the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence, where Britain had promised to turn the region into an independent Arabic nation-state, in exchange for the Arabs fighting against the Ottomans, who had sided with Austro-Hungary in the Great War. So, already we've got this two dates to the prom sitcom scenario, and wouldn't you know it, like with most snafus of the early modern period forward, the British Empire played a key role in the screwing of the pooch. But Lawrence of Arabia aside, the British wanted a nation in the region that could be within their sphere of influence, a proxy state with which they could exert puppet control over the region, because that's how empires work. And being the ambitious, industrious masters of empire that they were, the British entered two dogs in that race rather than just one. It's suspected that broad European anti-Semitic sentiments were part of why Britain wanted a neat little dumping ground for all their Jewish citizens, and that suited said Jewish folks just fine as, again, long history of anti-Semitism, in Europe especially, and as luck would have it, a Jewish journalist by the name of Theodor Herzl, born in 1860, had kinda cooked up the idea that the Jewish people needed a nation to call their own, thus birthing the ideology of modern Jewish nationalism, aka Zionism, which has since taken a pretty firm hold in a great many peoples to this day. So, it was a win-win for everybody, right? The Europeans want to evict most of their Jewish population, the Jewish people themselves kinda wanted to move anyways, there you go. This was further exacerbated by the anti-Semitic tensions leading up to and during World War II, where I don't feel I need to explain why a lot of Jews found the idea of their own place to call home and not fear persecution to be a pretty appealing sentiment. Obviously not every Jewish person in Europe made it, but certainly enough did that Israel came into existence. God, why do I feel like I'm forgetting something? Jeez. Don't you just hate that feeling? When the oven's still boiling over at home and your brain knows that, but it can't just tell you, you just have this stupid itch in the back of your cortex telling you, you need to remember something, you idiot! Oh right! There's already a bunch of people living in this region, and the British promised them dominion over this area. Fuck, that's right. Do you think they'll be mad that a bunch of people from other countries are suddenly immigrating en masse, operating under the assumption that they'll get to be the ones in charge of this place? Yeah, fuck, they're probably not going to be super stoked about that, right? Shit. Obviously, a bunch of immigrants popping in unannounced would normally not have the home field advantage. But since Britain at this point had committed to the idea of giving the region to the Jews as their proxy state, and had set up a temporary occupation during this transitory period, the Jewish population was able to get its foot in the door. And through further meddling via outside forces, read as Western powers, Israel has been consistently able to assert itself as the dominant force between the two, getting more favorable territory, getting more foreign aid, and here recently getting military aid from Britain's rowdy younger brother, the United States. Thus, Israel has consistently held the upper hand in the power dynamic between it and Palestine. And, yeah, there you have it. The genesis point of this whole Israel-Palestine conflict. Two roommates with conflicting personalities, one of whom is dating some snobby rich girl who inserts herself into everyone's business, both crammed together into a small New York studio apartment that they thought they were getting all to themselves. From there, things obviously get a little more complicated and a lot more heated, and there's way more history that could be covered between then and now. Please see my sources for some comprehensive overviews, but that kinda lets you in on how all this got started. Many events since then have exacerbated the conflict: an armed revolt, a general strike, increased militarization, a couple brief wars and surprise attacks, a UN-mandated partition, movement of the borders via annexation, the 1948 Nakba, which was an event coming on the heels of the Arab-Israeli War, where 700,000 Palestinians were forcefully evicted from their homes, their villages destroyed, all to make way for Israeli settlers. Just all kinds of things that have kept the tensions high between these two and have done very little to give those advocating peace much of a foothold. It's a long, bloody, nasty feud with a lot of hurt feelings and seemingly no end in sight. It did almost see a resolution in the early 90s thanks to Bill Clinton and the Oslo Accords, but when Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by far-right extremists from his own country, the rug kinda got pulled out from underneath the Accords and it didn't quite work out as well as it should have. Isn't that interesting? Peace in the region was thwarted by hyper-nationalistic sentiments acting against the best interests of both countries by dissolving their movements towards peace. Attempts were made to salvage the Oslo Accords, but when they failed, the Second Intifada happened, resulting in 1,000 dead Israelis and 3,300 dead Palestinians, and Israel reclaiming much of the land that it had ceded to Palestine. You'll notice that while religion is somewhat a factor in this conflict, it's not at all the central issue over which the two sides are squabbling. This isn't like the Catholics and the Protestants, or even the Crusades, where the details of one's God are the central point of contention. Outside of the most radical and fundamentalist of adherents, generally the faiths of Judaism and Islam are rather courteous of each other, as they're both, again, Abrahamic religions. They're more alike than dissimilar. That's not to say that some of the hard feelings might not get directed through religious channels. Certainly the Islamist extremist group Hamas is utilizing religious rhetoric in fomenting anger at the Israeli state and vice versa. But none of this would be solved if someone made a wish upon the Dragon Balls to turn everyone in the region into atheists. The two sides do harbor Islamophobic and anti-Semitic sentiments, but at the heart, the conflict is one of race and nationality, of colonizer and colonized, of systemic advantaging of one ethnic group over the other. Religion just makes it easier to do all that. Racism and nationalism, after all, are illogical mindsets, so having a second illogical worldview that people can get really hyper-passionate about, compounding your hatred, makes it that much more resistant to reason. If your God tells you that the other tribe is evil, your heart becomes hardened to human pleas for compassion and empathy, which is kind of the opposite of what religion is supposedly all about. And since we're on the topic of religion and the vile things it does to people, I should point out that a lot of evangelical Christians and Catholics, whom you'd initially think wouldn't have much at stake in all this, are actually pretty pro-Zionism. Now, Islamophobia isn't an unheard of attitude among Christians. Here again, I cite the Crusades and also 9/11. But Christians also have a long history of anti-Semitism. I'm just going to use Christians as a blanket term for a bunch of different denominations, don't at me. Now, some of it is the misguided notion that the Jews killed Jesus, which is stupid because Jesus was a Jew, as were most of his friends, and it was the Romans who actually killed him, and also Jesus needed to get crucified anyways for Christianity to be a thing in the first place, but when has any of this had to make any sense? But also, there's a lot of misconceptions that Christians hold about Jews because at one point in time, the church forbade the practice of money lending, aka banking. And that's something that the Jews didn't have rules against, and so a lot of Jews were able to see a fair bit of wealth accrual and influence, and thus they got unfairly characterized as particularly greedy and immoral, all because of some dumb fuck limitation that Christians put on their own dipshit selves. And isn't that ironic? Christians at one point in time recognized the corrupting influence of hoarding wealth as explicitly stated in their own religious texts, see the passages listed on screen and many others for example, but then suddenly forgot this material analysis, and rather than attribute this bad behavior to systems of profit-seeking and money lust, they instead just conclude that the Jews are supernaturally evil for a rule that they, again, imposed on their own damn selves. Man, if only Christians read their own fucking Bibles enough to remember that money and avarice were the root of all evil. Jesus was anti-capitalist and anti-war, you stupid fuckers. But getting back on topic, a lot of evangelical Christians are actually huge Zionists because according to the Bible, the Jewish people controlling the Holy Land is part of what is prophesied to trigger the book of Revelations and the second coming of Christ. And therefore, Christians think that by supporting Israel, they're actually moving this world of sinners into the endgame scenario. Wouldn't you fucking know it, they didn't actually read the book, they just skipped to the end to read the last chapter because, I don't know, they had book reports due the next day. Yes, all this struggle and strife in the world really is just a fucking game to these evangelicals. God damn it, they're terrible. And since this process apparently necessitates the elimination of Palestine, I guess you should look at this whole thing as an apocalyptic blood ritual, which Christians believe will lead to the extermination and eternal damnation of all the sinners and unfaithful, which in their eyes definitely includes the Jews as well, since the Jews don't recognize Jesus as Lord. Religion of forgiveness and love my ass, this is more in line with Lovecraft than anything. And here the Spanish conquistadors thought that the human sacrifices of the Aztecs, the Mayans, and the Incas were fucking barbaric. It's like I've said before, it's only savagery when people you don't like are doing the killing, but when the people you like do it, they're steadfast and noble warriors, fulfilling their duty. And if and when Israel conquers all of Palestine and drives all the Palestinian people out and or kills them, and then Jesus doesn't come back, when the 7 seals aren't unsealed, when the angels don't blow their trumpets, and when the 4 horsemen don't descend upon the world in a fashion more literal than figurative, when their necromantic doomsday spell doesn't work, do you think that the evangelicals are going to self-reflect and realize what a stupid, hateful, bloodthirsty, and superstitious bunch of morons they are? Of course not. They'll just assume they did it wrong. Maybe Israel needs to conquer more territories. Maybe the problem is that there's too many Jewish people running around in places other than Israel. Maybe they need to be forcibly relocated to the Holy Land in order for Armageddon to turn on. Maybe Christians need to politically pressure the Jews into leaving the US, or just kick them out. Or fuck all that. That's too much work. Maybe when telling Jews to leave their home doesn't work, Christians decide that they just need to start exterminating any Jews who don't live in Israel. And then we've come full circle back to the Holocaust and back to what Israel is currently doing to Palestine. I tell ya, with that much ritual bloodshed, I sincerely doubt we'd summon some all-loving Messiah. Best case scenario, we'd just get a really pissed off Captain Planet. But the more likely outcome is some kind of cosmic horror from beyond the veils of space-time. And if you notice by now that my biased human sympathies seem to be a little slanted to one of these two sides over the other between Israel and Palestine, that's indeed no accident. I'll come out and say it, between the two roommates, I tend to favor the one that doesn't have the rich girlfriend throwing her weight around in all their arguments. In this conflict, I tend to have greater sympathy for the Palestinians over the Israelis. Not because of some deep-seated hatred towards the Israeli people, or some hatred of Jewishness, or some secret part of me that identifies with Islamic Arabs, but because of the two, Palestine is the clear underdog. Which is not at all to say that I have zero sympathies for Israeli citizens at all, or that I feel that every action done on behalf of Palestinian citizens is completely justified. And while I'll extend a lot of blame to outside forces acting through Israel or acting to enable Israel, I don't want anyone to get the impression that Israel is totally blameless either. But I don't want anyone to think, God, does it feel like I'm firing off a lot of disclaimers and qualifying statements for this fucking video? Like, way more than I should have to? Alright, here it is, mainstream media. I denounce Hamas. Sorry that that's not my entire video. Maybe if Piers Morgan was here, I'd just spend the entire time talking about how awful Hamas is. But he's not, so it's only going to be this brief segment. Hamas are a bunch of kill-crazy Islamic fundamentalist theocratic fascists who use indiscriminate terrorist violence against Israeli citizens and soldiers alike in order to achieve their goals, not unlike the evangelicals I just got done describing. They are undoubtedly anti-Semitic, and given the chance for the shoe to be on the other foot, they absolutely would pursue genocide against Israel and the Jewish people too. If the shoe were on the other foot, maybe it'd be the far-right Palestinian nationalists fucking up the bizarro World Oslo Accords instead. Once again, huge shocker, being a religious zealot doesn't actually make you more righteous and compassionate, it just makes you more convinced that other people deserve to die because they're sinners who believe in a different God or call him something different, and that's apparently tantamount to working for Satan. The attack on October 7th was unconscionable, and if you compare the number of people killed to the population at the time, this attack far, far outweighs the per capita deaths of the 9/11 attacks. Fuck Hamas, all my homies hate Hamas. And yet, my sympathies still side with Palestine over Israel. Not because I like Hamas, not because I hate all Israelis, but because the everyday folks of Palestine are the disproportionate victims in all of this. They're the ones suffering the most from the conflict with Israel. They've been pushed around and systemically oppressed by Israel's greater capacity for force. Palestinians who enlist with Hamas view themselves as freedom fighters because the conditions they're forced to live under are so dire. And Israel's needlessly brutal response to October 7th attack demonstrates how little concern the state of Israel has for Palestinians. Hamas militants are people who have been pushed so far and so hard for so long that they're now lashing out because they figure they'll either break free of the unacceptable situation they find themselves in, or they'll die trying. And Hamas leadership takes those angry people with legitimate grievance and galvanizes them with hateful rhetoric. They're a very bad organization with very bad tactics and philosophy, but they only are able to be so driven because they have such unfortunate circumstances to motivate them. There was this recent episode of South Park. Yeah, we're doing this. Shut up. I know I said I wasn't going to do this with Gundam, but just give me like 2 seconds. This recent episode of South Park pitched the concept of the, quote, Mexican Joker. The episode was about the terrible conditions of the child prisoners at American ICE facilities and how this horrific treatment of children from a politically disadvantaged group was going to make any children who survive and escape these facilities become so bitter and disaffected and resentful that they would grow up to become violent radicals with a searing grudge against a country that imprisoned them, tormented them, humiliated them, separated them from their families, dehumanized them, and in not too infrequent cases, killed them. It would turn them into some real-life equivalent of a psycho supervillain terrorist, not unlike the Joker. And that's basically what Hamas is. It's a group of Palestinian jokers of Israel's own creation. Remember that thing I mentioned from 1948, the Nakba? That's an Arabic word meaning tragedy. And to remind you of what I said, 700,000 Palestinians were driven from their homes, were forcibly removed from their houses, their land, and forced into the wilderness so that Israeli people could live in the places where those Palestinians were. And you can bet there was violence involved. There's still violence involved. It's implicit in the maintaining of the border between Israel and the two small, enclosed, disconnected regions that make up Palestine. Even though it happened 70 years ago, and it's been back and forth a little bit since then, once again the Oslo Accords, there are border walls to remind Palestinians that one of these two sides hold the power, and their barely disguised contempt for the other is evident. Israel may have even helped fund Hamas in their early days in the hopes that Hamas would knock out another Palestinian insurgent group, the Fatah, who at the time the Israeli government considered the greater threat. They have so little regard for the Palestinian people that they hope they'll all just kill each other, not considering that they might have been trading one problem group for a larger one. I guess credit where it's due, these two groups did compete against each other rather than align. At the very least, the IDF did not concern itself with policing Hamas in its early days as much as they did with the Fatah, and the bigotry of their low expectations led them to today. And I guess it paid off because this greater threat helps the Israeli government justify to itself the further brutalization of Palestine. They feel justified in continuously carpet bombing Palestine to make sure they stamp out these people so they can seize more territory. And ultimately, a lot of Palestinians feel pressured to join Hamas because Israel does pose such a significant threat, and Palestine officially doesn't. Hamas has some institutionalized power in Palestine's Gaza Strip, but they're not an officially recognized part of Palestine's armed forces because Palestine doesn't really have a formal army. There's the Palestine Liberation Army, approximately a couple thousand troops, but that's about it. They don't really have funding for much official activity. Hamas has a greater membership count than the Palestinian military, but their organization isn't some strictly regimented bureaucracy like the armies of most countries. They're just a group of extremist terrorist guerrillas with a fairly high membership. Hamas has to resort to terror tactics because they don't have the training, organization, or arms to be a formal military force. And because they're a bunch of radicals without uniforms, they operate by striking suddenly, doing as much damage as they can, and either running away to hide or being gunned down by the much better equipped Israeli Defense Force, because that's the situation they find themselves in. Once again, Palestine's land is comprised of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, both of which are walled off by Israel, both of which have their utilities controlled from the outside by Israel, both of which are patrolled by the IDF. There's about 5 million people living in these spaces, with the median age being about 19 or 20. Palestinians under the age of 18 represent about 44% of Palestine's population. Since October 7th, Israel has shut off power and water to Palestine, have blocked humanitarian aid, and Israel's bombings of Palestinian hospitals, schools, and businesses have claimed the lives of about 22,000 people. Israel claims that it is trying to root out Hamas, who, I remind you, have taken about 240 people hostage, and claims that Hamas is using the citizens of Palestine as human shields. But since Hamas isn't a formal military, their bases and hideouts would necessarily be among citizens, and Israel's tactics demonstrate that they're not interested in using careful surgical tactics to defeat Hamas and spare the lives of hostages and non-combatants. I should note that recently there was a 4-day pause in the bombing so that Hamas could release 24 of their hostages in exchange for 39 Palestinian prisoners, but then it went straight back to the bombing, and again, they initially took 240 hostages, so they still have a bunch of people there whom they're supposedly using as human shields. Now, the thing about human shields, you see, is that they're effective not because they take bullets for you, but because they're meant to prevent the opponent from firing at all. But Israel is proving that the human shield tactic isn't effective here because time and again they just shoot through them anyways. So it's peculiar why Hamas would keep employing it as a strategy. After all, Hamas didn't give up all of their hostages, but after 4 days, Israel went right back to bombing. It's almost like it's not a strategy at all. Or maybe it is. I mean, Hamas are bad guys, like I said, but if Israel's shooting through the human shields, they're not exactly good guys just because they happen to be fighting bad guys. If bad guys are the people who willingly kill innocent civilians in order to accomplish their goals, well, Hamas and Israel both fit that description in this scenario. Two sides of bad guys can fight. There doesn't always have to be a side that's a good guy's side, you know? Sometimes it's just bad guys on all ends. And again, roughly 44% of those 15,000 Palestinians killed were likely under 18 years old. And further, despite Hamas not being a presence in Palestine's West Bank, a territory which I remind you is completely separated from the Gaza Strip by land belonging to Israel, it again has been subject to Israel's bombing campaign. And Israeli officials don't exactly seem all that broken up about it. Their hyper-nationalist sentiments and policies create and maintain the systems that frustrate Palestinians enough that they turn to Hamas and their extreme measures in order to strike back. After all, they keep taking Palestinian land. They control Palestinian utilities. They guard and patrol and enforce their will on Palestinian citizens. It's been described as an open-air concentration camp. These actions are being described as genocidal, and it's really not hard to see it that way. Israel holds the cards, and Israel benefits from intruding further and further into Palestinian land. It's not exactly looking like the Israeli government see the people of Palestine as, well, people. So many of their words and actions betray a barely contained contempt for a group of people who are an inconvenience to them. And Israel's nationalism motivates them to downplay or hide or lie about their military actions against Palestine. According to them, Hamas is hiding around every corner, is arming and indoctrinating every dead Palestinian child, is occupying every Palestinian hospital and school, is influencing every outside force that speaks out against Israel. So many journalists covering the situation end up being unfortunate casualties of Israel's broad, unfocused, overwhelming attacks. Any criticism of their tactics or statement of facts inconvenient to Israel are met with accusations of anti-Semitism and the assertion that they have the right to defend themselves without any interest in navigating the proportionality of that defense. One of the innumerable incidents that occurred during the making of this video, which admittedly took a while for a number of personal reasons, was on December 15th, 3 Israeli hostages were killed by the IDF whilst these hostages were seeking rescue by these IDF soldiers. During a combat situation in Gaza, in an area where the IDF knew that there were hostages, they heard cries for help coming in Hebrew, in Israel's own language, and during a moment of ceasefire, 3 Israeli hostages emerged carrying a white flag, shouting in Hebrew, their shirts removed to indicate a lack of arms or explosives, their hands in the air, and the IDF soldiers gunned them down. Their excuse was that they thought that they were Hamas militants in disguise. They're so hyped up on paranoia and utter contempt for Palestinians that they gunned down their own countrymen on the off chance that they were pulling some elaborate, improbable ruse. This is just fucking cartoonish levels of brutal, hateful, needless cruelty. It's fascism, pure and simple. If you say anything bad about how Israel is handling things, they just conclude that you side with Hamas rather than simply sympathizing with Palestinians, because Israel views those two groups as interchangeable. Hamas is apparently everywhere at once, cannot be reasoned with, and is supernaturally evil. In fact, they're even pushing the idea that they might be worse than the Nazis. On October 18th, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu claimed that Hitler only got the idea for the Holocaust from Jerusalem's then Grand Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, and that originally Hitler only wanted to expel the Jews, but that al-Husseini convinced him to take it a step further because al-Husseini didn't want the Jews to come to Palestine. Now, there's no record of this exchange, of course. The two men were acquainted, but isn't it convenient how this story seeks to make Arabic folk seem even worse than the Nazis? Which almost sounds like you're cutting the Nazis some slack. Netanyahu's trying to say, gee, I don't know, the Nazis were bad, but it was the Arabs who came up with the idea, so maybe they're worse or something, I don't know. Which, no, not true. Even if this story you said was true, which it isn't, that would still just be one Arabic dude pitching this idea, and then Germany saying, no, actually, that's really good, let's do that. And then they spend several years doing that idea. So they're still fucking worse, dog. It's so bad that German Chancellor Angela Merkel actually came out and refuted Netanyahu's statements and said, Adolf Hitler and Germany are solely responsible for the Holocaust. And it's not an accidental statement, and he's not the only one making it. Israel's own Minister of Economy and Industry, Nir Barkat, is quoted as saying, what Hamas is committing is worse than what the Nazis did. You know, the Nazis who killed 6 million people? Hamas is worse than that somehow, despite not having killed 100,000 people yet. Wow, that's amazing. Despite Israel being the ones maintaining this open-air concentration camp, their enemies are actually worse than the Nazis. This is Holocaust revisionism, pure and simple. It's making what the Nazis did seem less bad so that you can paint someone else as worse. What the fuck? Israel's been able to get away with it for so long because they've had the backing of Britain, the UN, and the US for so long, and that's given them a disproportionate advantage in the conflict and has emboldened them to push and oppress Palestinians far more than they would if they weren't being supported by these various entities, most especially the US. The US, being currently the #1 global superpower in the world, has allied itself with Israel for the sake of maintaining a military stronghold in the region to oppose Iran. And the US does this. It keeps international military bases and supplies allied nations with arms, not just because having proxy states is a handy way for having a leg up on geopolitical adversaries, but because selling and maintaining military might is good business. Arms manufacturers hold a strong sway over the US government. Isn't it weird how we always find some other military quagmire to embed ourselves in, even if we're not officially at war or directly involved in a conflict? Even if the stakes or the gains aren't entirely clear? Even if the morality of the situation is very dubious, we always find some way to go back to war. The US has a military presence in international sites all over the world, and each base not only has to be built and staffed and equipped, but constantly maintained and updated and resupplied, all of which costs money, all of which is funded by us taxpayers. It's not just enough to have a soldier, pay his salary, give him a gun and a uniform and a vehicle, but we have to keep that gun loaded, have to keep that gun repaired, have to keep replacing his armor when it receives damage, keep fuel in his vehicle, keep replacing parts in that vehicle, have to give him a new, better gun or vehicle or armor when we develop the next thing to give us an advantage over enemy soldiers, have to constantly be researching the next best piece of equipment, have to give our troops the advantage with high-tech comms units, high-tech surveillance units, high-tech stealth equipment, high-tech field equipment, etc., etc. All of that costs money, and the people who make that money put some of those ill-gotten gains into the pockets of politicians so that those politicians will keep finding excuses for us to keep arming soldiers and maintaining bases, keep finding excuses for us to keep funding other people's wars, keep finding excuses for us to be ever on guard. And sometimes there is something to defend against, sometimes there is a danger to be fought, but most of the time, we're just going out to spin our wheels, flex our muscles, and prove that we're still the biggest dogs in the yard, and keep other people from doing the shit that they want to do because we don't like it. I mean, what were we doing in Afghanistan for 20 fucking years? We certainly didn't accomplish anything other than flushing billions of dollars of taxpayer money down the fucking toilet and getting lots of people killed. You can complain about our withdrawal from Afghanistan. What the fuck were we doing there in the first place? Can you tell me? Do you have any fucking idea? And if it was so important, why didn't it get done within those 20 years? Hell, Joe Biden himself, back in 1986, when he was still a senator, is quoted as saying, "Were there not an Israel, the United States would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region." This is a quote from our current president that he said almost 40 years ago, explicitly stating that the US has a strictly imperialistic interest in the region. And it's still the driving motivation in our foreign policy to this very day. In recent weeks, Biden has once again pledged full, unwavering support to Israel in this conflict, because what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Every US president knows this and has been a willing participant in this. Trump, Obama, W, Clinton, Daddy Bush, so on, all of them dancing to the tune of Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and Northrop Grumman. Huh, would you look at that? Just like evangelicals, we're consciously aware that the ultra-wealthy are evil, and yet we let them do whatever the hell they want while we keep finding excuses to hate each other. Guess we're not so different after all. Sorry, Christians, I was too hard on you. That's my bad. The US military budget for 2021 was over $800 billion, a roughly 3% increase from the year prior. The next highest military spender, the UK, spent around $68 billion that same year, which is less than a tenth of what the US spent. $800 billion going to people who profit off of death and thus are incentivized to perpetuate it. We always have enough money for bombs, but never enough for schools or healthcare or infrastructure or the environment. Being involved in Israel puts obscene amounts of money into the hands of the ultra-wealthy and allows the US to exert puppet control over events in the region. So when Israel needs something, you can bet we can and will make that happen. Israel doesn't control the US, we just have a fucked up symbiotic relationship with it. And when people suggest that maybe the US doesn't need to be supporting Israel, they get shut down fast and hard. Polls show that about 70% of Americans support a ceasefire in the Israel-Palestine conflict, but almost no one at the federal level seems willing or able to use the term ceasefire at all, and anyone who does gets dealt with swiftly. House Representative from Michigan, Rashida Tlaib, one of 2 Muslim congresswomen and herself Palestinian, spoke out saying, quote, "I can't believe I have to say this, but Palestinian people are not disposable. We are human beings just like anyone else. The cries of Palestinian and Israeli children sound no different to me. What I don't understand is why the cries of Palestinians sound different to you all." She also stated that, quote, "But let me be clear, my criticism has always been of the Israeli government and Netanyahu's actions. It is important to separate people and governments, Mr. Chair. No government is beyond criticism. The idea that criticizing the government of Israel is anti-Semitic sets a very dangerous precedent, and it's being used to silence diverse voices speaking up for human rights across our nation." Shortly thereafter, 22 Democratic representatives joined all 212 Republican representatives in a vote to censure Tlaib in their ongoing discussions on the topic. And that's to say nothing of what some college campuses are threatening to do to student protesters who support Palestine. Many colleges are threatening to blacklist or expel students who speak out or rally or protest in defense of Palestine. Or hey, what about Mehdi Hassan, a broadcaster who had his own show on MSNBC, where he was lightly but consistently and pointedly more critical of Israel in this conflict, right up until his show was suddenly canceled in November. There aren't a lot of mainstream media figures who are willing to deviate from the expected standard of manufacturing consent for the US's continued support of Israel, and that's true at both Fox and CNN. And like Representative Tlaib, I want to stress that my beef is with those people in positions of authority who are engaging in these actions that exacerbate the situation, or who could do something about this, but are choosing not to. No demographic of people are a monolith, but I do have some general blame I can throw around. I don't blame Palestinians or the Islamic community, I blame Hamas. I don't blame Israelis or the Jewish community, I blame the Israeli government and the IDF. I don't blame Americans, I blame our politicians and war profiteers. And I don't blame people for being scared and upset, but I do have plenty of criticism for anyone war-hawking for this conflict, no matter what their reason is. America is famously unsympathetic towards brown people the world over, and Muslim folks especially, ever since 9/11. So anyone cheering for Israel to keep trampling over Palestine is showing some real ugliness. And I get why a lot of Jewish folks the world over are feeling vulnerable right now. The long history of anti-Semitism is not a closed chapter of history, and this war is definitely inflaming anti-Semitic sentiments. Not just from Hamas and many Palestinians who are being hurt by Israel, but from anti-Semites all over who either view this aggression as proof of Jewish people's barbarism, or hate both sides equally and want them to wipe each other out, or even those who are hoping that the Jews can kickstart the rapture so that Jesus will descend from heaven and consign all the non-believers to hell. And the fact that Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world, whilst Judaism has the smallest number of adherents of all the mainstream faiths out there, that's not making any of them any less nervous. And it's not just Palestine that Israel has beef with, but with Lebanon, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Qatar, Turkey, Yemen, Jordan, and maybe also Saudi Arabia. Just about every one of Israel's neighbors would love to see Hamas tear them apart. I can kinda see why some non-Israeli Jews might then be rooting for Israel, hoping that they can post a dub for the Jewish faith after so many devastating L's, but guys, This isn't the way. Not like this. I want good things for the Jewish community and Israeli citizens. I want them to feel safe and be able to prosper, but not at the cost of so much innocent bloodshed. This is doing more harm than good in the long run. Israel's systemic abuse of Palestine is provoking violence that hurts Israeli citizens too. It's not making them safer. Anyone thoughtlessly endangering the lives of so many innocents in the name of achieving their goals must be held to account, and this applies to the IDF and Netanyahu as well as Hamas. Jewish nationalism, Zionism, is not making Jewish people the world over safer. Israeli citizens are threatened by Hamas because of the actions of the Israeli state, and anti-Semites the world over feel justified and emboldened to attack Jewish people over this conflict, simply because we have conflated the interest of Jews with the interest of the Israeli state. And those are clearly not the same and clearly not in the best interest of Jewish folks, as evidenced by these attacks. Racism and nationalism are always self-harming practices, and safety for Jews earned by the apartheid and genocide of Palestinians is unacceptable. Not only should we be advocating for a ceasefire, for an end to these hostilities, but we need to be looking at and addressing the conditions that Palestinians are forced to live under. We need to remedy these grievances that Palestine has that are fueling Hamas's hatred and causing Palestinians to identify with their horrific, violent cause. You can stop Hamas not by hunting down and murdering every Hamas militant, but by taking away the things that fuel their hatred. If you address the problems, even if a few people still have nothing but hatred for Israelis, the majority of people who are just fighting for their right to live will lay down their arms. It's probably going to require that Israel give up some of their land to Palestine, give up a lot of advantages that make them feel secure, and it's going to require some people be held responsible for all this tragedy and violence. Hamas, obviously, but also Israeli leadership who demonstrate this desire for out-and-out cruelty, and for many of the soldiers who are just following orders. And if there was any justice in this world, there'd be consequences for people outside of Israel and Palestine who have been complicit and supportive of this ongoing apartheid. Every single US president's administration for the last 70 years has either supported Israel or stood by while they perpetuated their heinous actions. The UN and UK are guilty too. Plenty of corporations share some responsibility for these atrocities. And if you notice this list of powerful, guilty people growing rather long by now, and your capacity for pattern recognition is factoring in what I said about how so much of our governments are unilaterally disinterested in applying nuance and humanity to this situation, you're probably coming to the realization that so much of this is kind of a hopeless scenario. You cannot appeal to the morality of systems of oppression, because if morality was of any concern, they wouldn't be oppressive in the first place. So what can be done? Well, I'll admit, viewer, only so much. It's not an easy fight or one with much chance for success, but it's necessary. So here's what I can offer up. For one, keep educated and informed. There's obviously so much of this situation that I wasn't able to cover, either due to a lack of time or my own ignorance. It's just so much he said, she said, so many daily developments, that even just having a basic understanding of the events as they occur will go a long way to keeping from being apathetic about it. Evil prevails when good men do nothing, as the saying goes, and just chalking this situation up to a bunch of religious crazies having some nebulous, centuries-long feud is not helpful to this discourse. People need to be thinking about and talking about this. Break the stereotype of Americans not knowing anything outside of America. A lot of people have started floating the idea that they should boycott voting for the Democrats so long as they keep aiding and abetting Israel's actions. But I don't really see this being an effective tactic. It's not like the Republicans will be any better about this issue. If anything, they'll be worse, and not voting is a great way to find out just how much worse they'll be. Plus, not voting for Democrats
has never been an effective strategy in getting Democrats to do what you want, and most of the people who operate on that logic don't vote anyways. Either way, someone's winning that election, and whoever it is likely going to continue the trend of foreign policy that's been a staple for decades. You not pulling the trolley lever doesn't change who dies, you just become complicit in helping elect the other guy. I'm sorry, there's no way out of this one. But further than that, I feel that relying entirely on electoralism and boycotts is just demonstrating an inability to escape stupid neoliberal mindsets in terms of approaching politics. Direct action is called for. Politicians can be pressured and bullied into shifting course on policy a little with some outside-the-box thinking. Protests and political statements can take all kinds of nonviolent forms that make it clear that we, the people, do not approve of how this situation is being handled and can persuade those in power to pursue alternatives and pressure those most directly involved into de-escalating the conflict. And America making an earnest attempt to try to convince Israel to take it easy and consider peace would probably go a long way to settling things down. We hold the purse strings after all. Maybe we have another round of Oslo Accords in us if our politicians could just be encouraged to setting up some diplomatic meetings. And at the very least, screaming and throwing dog shit at the homes of your state's members of Congress is at least a little more proactive than just posting memes to Instagram about how you're not going to be voting in the next election. I know that's not a great suggestion, but if you've got something better, I invite you to put your plan into action, viewer. I'm open to ideas. Post it in the comments down below. My concern, as always, is for the safety, freedom, and happiness for all peoples. Now, if this was a typical episode, I'd be closing by referencing this episode's mecha series, bringing the themes full circle and thereby justifying the inclusion of the robot. I think in this case, I'd probably make some remark about our souls being weighed down by Earth's gravity, or hey, I recently watched all of Gundam 00, and I've got an Exia kit, and there's a wealth of parallels between the events of that series and the events of recent history, but nothing about this episode is typical. Nothing about this should be typical. We should be appalled by what is happening. We should be sickened by these events, by the way this is being handled, and by the roles being played by everyone encouraging or enabling it. So get informed and get active. Included in my collection of links down below is one that links to a Palestinian charity you can donate to if you're so inclined. There's another thing that you can do that's better than just boycotting an election. You can participate in a mutual aid effort. Doing something small is better than doing nothing, and few things are as nothing as refusing to vote. But anyways, thanks for listening to this special episode of Chatbots. If you saw my Scope Dog episode, you know that I had planned on doing an episode about Megazone 2-3. Unfortunately, the kit that I got for that episode wasn't exactly what I hoped for, so I'm shelving that one for now. Things have been kinda hectic for me lately, and rather than just jump into the next script I had lined up, I felt like I had to discuss this subject. Now, if you like this video, go ahead and rocket punch the like button, go ahead and aim your beam rifle at the subscribe button, go ahead and take a blazing sword to the notifications bell, go ahead and transform and roll out in the comments section, and if you're feeling so inclined, go ahead and share this video so we can combine with other viewers to make our giant robot viewer base into a bigger robot. Here's the next kit I plan to build. It's Gunbuster. Pretty cool, very excited for that. I'm DBiddles, this is Chatbots. Sayonara, bye-bye.